Great.
I'd like to sit down and be a little creative for a while.
Yeah, I know you need a little
Circle
time
in
and
on
focus
myself
for
a
that.
bit.
Absolutely, yeah. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Sukey Forbes is with us today. She is here to talk about her book, The Angel in My Pocket. Sukey is a blogger also for the Huffington Post. As her name suggests, she is a member of the Forbes family. The Angel in My Pocket is a book about how she found a way to survive the death of her daughter through gaining a better understanding of where her daughter is now. Welcome, Sukey.
Thank you so much.
You open this book by talking about the island that is owned by your family, which contains a barn that is basically a giant family tree. Mm-hmm. Both the island and the barn have been a source of great comfort to you. Can you tell us about them?
Well, the barn itself is, I think like many families, I've had the benefit of knowing multiple generations who have been here. And that has been a tremendous source of comfort, to be able to, in times of trouble and in times of celebration, to reflect back on other family members who may have experienced the same thing. Many years ago, or perhaps in the early 70s, a family member decided to take the genealogy that went back to my great-great-great-grandfather and put it onto one wall in a barn. And as the family has grown, 9 generations later, it has expanded to 4 walls. And everybody is there, and everybody is labeled and represented. And then there are photographs in the center section of each family member. That sense of connection and continuity has always been an important piece of who I am as a person, and it was increasingly important when my daughter died. For a number of reasons, the first of which was I knew that that small card on the wall would always be there, and she would always be remembered. There would always be a photograph of her. She would be archived in some way. And I know other family members who had passed away in the late 1800s, and there are photographs of them, and I know them, and I know the features of their face. And that was very comforting to know that other generations to come of the family would not forget her. In terms of the place itself, I don't think it's unique to just my family, but there is an enormous sense of comfort in any place that is one goes to continuously.
Yeah.
And so for me, walking became, and that's very much a through line of our family. We've found very much a sense of God in nature, and we take to the woods when we're trying to figure out matters of head and heart. So I did a lot of feeling and healing, walking on the paths there, being not necessarily in the company of family, but knowing that they were there.
Right. And your great-great-great-grandfather, Ralph Waldo Emerson, is somebody who spent time on the island as well, and he's on the wall. You also feel a particular sense of connection to him, don't you?
I do, and one would think that with an antecedent of that magnitude, that he would have loomed large over every aspect of our life growing up. But he didn't. I would say that the culture, very sort of the ethos of who he was in terms of self-reliance, and again the divinity in each of us and in nature, that was very much a part of my childhood. But we didn't sit around the table and discuss Emerson, and that was never required reading as a child. And it wasn't really until I lost my own child that I started to look through family papers to find somebody who may have had that shared experience. And one of the legacies of being part of a old Yankee Brahmin family is we're not big on sharing our feelings.
Yeah.
And so I had to really dig and look at photographs and read letters. And I came to Emerson because it turns out he had a son who was 6. He had a son who died of a high fever. And I had a daughter who was 6, and I had a daughter who died of a high fever. And all of a sudden, that kinship drew me to him and pulled me into his readings and gave me so much more of an interested microscope when I looked through them.
And he said something very profound about sorrow, how it makes us all into children.
Yeah, sorrow makes us all children again, destroys all differences of intellect. The wisest know nothing.
Yeah. And you must have experienced that yourself.
I really did. In fact, when I wrote all of the pieces of The Angel in My Pocket, it was very clear that the transformation that took place along the point of the book is grief rendered me, and I think many of us, and not just grief, but any major tragedy, like a child. And I had to rebuild my entire belief system from how I felt about children and about marriage and about what I felt about God and family. Absolutely every aspect of my life was rebuilt, and I had to turn into an adult.
This island has ghosts. How did you feel about the ghosts on the island before you lost your daughter, and how did losing her change your perspective, or did it?
Well, that's a great question, because for me there is a disconnect a bit between the relationship that I've come to have with my daughter, which is that of sort of a wisdom being, an angel, what have you. I don't actually think of her as an angel, but I think of her as some sort of separate soul who is on a higher plane or level of consciousness than we are. And I pray to her as readily as I would pray to a god. In terms of childhood and being raised in houses, not just at my family's summer home, but the house I grew up in, and there were always the presence of spirits. And I think part of that may be that any old house, when you know the history, it makes it much easier to believe in that sense. I will also say, however, that some of us are more susceptible to feeling that energy, for lack of a better word. And the house that I grew up in as a child was built by my great-great-uncle, Alex, whose wife was actually named Charlotte. And his ghost was in that house. And I was terrified of it. I did not want to see him. I only had senses of him, but other family members and other friends had seen him. And I found it very scary and off-putting. I would say that after I have, over the last 10 years, after developing a better understanding of where we go after we die, I'm more willing to engage in discourse with these entities. I don't want to see them. That's still too scary. But there is a sense of, I know you're there. There's a sense of acknowledgement. And I don't really want them sitting around the dinner table and contributing to the conversation. But there is a sense that they share this space in some way.
Charlotte was only 4 when she had her first episode of the illness that would eventually claim her life. This happened at a vacation house in North Carolina. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the extraordinary thing about this, she came down with a very high fever, and it spiked within minutes. And it was terrifying, and we were 45 minutes from any kind of medical care. Except that very serendipitously, we ended up vacationing with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, both of whom are physicians, one of whom is a pediatric anesthesiologist who specializes in malignant hyperthermia, which is what ultimately took Charlotte's life, and it's the body's inability to regulate itself. So Annie treated her, my sister-in-law, and who else travels with an IV bag for a young child? But she happened to have one, and she got fluids into her, and we transported her, and she ended up being fine. But the next morning, Annie pulled me aside, and she said, People will think that you're crazy, but I am telling you that this is what I saw. I know it. There's very little we can do other than manage it, but I'm quite sure that this presentation is an indication of a non-triggered malignant hyperthermia. And the way you treat that is just by managing it. And so we spent the next 2 years managing it. We knew that it was somewhat of a ticking time bomb, but I honestly never thought it would take her life. I just thought it was going to be something that might cause issues later in life or lead to something else, but I did not think, and probably part of that was my inability to face it, that it would ultimately take her life.
That day, that first episode, she went off to the emergency room, but by the time she got there, the temperature was down. She was kind of looking okay, maybe a little sick. I think she vomited or something. And the emergency room staff did not take your sister-in-law's assessment very seriously, did they?
They were very dismissive, and I understand why, and she was very clear about it. And you know, 10 years out, Charlotte is part of a sample of, you know, fewer than 10 presentations of this. And so they've studied the samples all over the world, and it's hard to get your mind around the fact that modern medicine being what it is, we would have answers. Because what the malignant hypothermia is a marker for other illnesses, and it's a syndrome, and I may be using some of these words incorrectly, but she died from a malignant hyperthermic episode. But what ultimately caused that, aside from a gene, we don't know. There was, I'm sure, some underlying condition that at some point in the future we'll find out. For some people, I suppose that might keep them up at night, but for me, the end result is still the same. It took her life, and she's not coming back. And I can be tortured by all of the ins and outs of that, or deal with the actual loss of what that means to us as a family and individually, and process that and move through life.
Because, well, that's one of the problems with very rare diseases, that there isn't a lot of research because there isn't a big enough group to actually study. And in even your regular pediatrician, when you tried to tell her about what the episode, didn't take you seriously. Would that have made any difference?
You know, I have such a high regard for my sister-in-law Anne that I already had put, I was already quite sure that Anne was right. And so I had a slight level of frustration and disappointment that the pediatrician was not taking me seriously. And I just proceeded along that path anyway. And this is a condition that we just manage anyway. And she was a very healthy child otherwise. She was very active. The photograph on the cover of the book was taken 3 days before she passed away, you know, in a bathing suit, running off to the beach with her brother and sister. Now, the odd thing about the photograph is if you look at it, there's a small orb that's circling Charlotte's head. And I don't know where that came from, and I don't know what that means, but it adds this sort of odd supernatural bent to the whole thing. So when we were trying to decide on the jacket art, that was a photograph that was immediately unanimously seized upon as the one that we should use.
When you were growing up, your experience of being parented was different. Can you tell us, can you tell us what your experience was and how that affected how you parented your own children?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I grew up very much in an old Yankee home, and I thought my childhood was rather normal. I thought that we were somewhat impoverished because we didn't have much furniture, and we had overturned boxes in our house that we used as coffee tables, and the laundry was all kept in one room, and it was stored probably in a 17th century highboy, but when you're young, you're not paying attention to that.
Some old piece of furniture.
It was very there was a lot of contrast that I wasn't able to make sense of. And there was almost a perverse sense of pride in living a very austere life that I did not understand at all. So I just decided that we were quite poor, despite very obvious markers to the contrary. And I think there is, particularly in New England, some sense of pride of that. And I'm not quite sure where that comes from, maybe a shame or an embarrassment about having so much, or being privileged and not wanting to look that way. So there's sort of this reaction that takes it in the opposite direction.
In quite an extreme direction, in fact.
But my parents were, they both grew up in very similar ways, and I think they were very well suited to each other in terms of their parenting styles. They were very hands-off, and part of that was the time period, and part of that was the through line of Emersonian self-reliance taken to extreme. So off we would go with axes to split wood to heat our house that had a furnace that was fueled by wood, and nobody batted an eyelash at that sort of chore that you did on Saturday afternoon as an 8-year-old.
And also that sort of hands-off parenting style of your parents affected your ability to go to your mom or your dad with problems or sorrows or worries. How did that play out in your childhood?
Well, I definitely felt alone. I was very lonely throughout my childhood. And I think that, there's an interesting combination of nature and nurture in all of us. And I was very aware from a young age of how wonderful so many aspects of my world were in terms of my family and the beauty of where we lived and how we moved through our day. I was very aware of that. But I was also very, very lonely because nobody talked. And we had this, if we were over exuberant in any way, outside of the bell curve, too excited or too angry, we'd be sent outside to run 3 times around the house. Sort of calm down, pull yourself together. And this overwhelming message of keeping hold of yourself and maintaining self-control at all costs, that was so deeply rooted inside me that when my daughter died, I was absolutely paralyzed in my ability to access any emotion whatsoever, because the fear of coming completely unglued was more than I could stand. And so that was the first half of my struggle, was even coming to terms with that and finding a way to actually feel anything. And I felt quite like a monster for several months. My husband was grieving in a much more expected way or standard, visible way, and I was so envious of that. And I was so envious of the strong religious background that he had in Catholicism for the very first time in my life, because we were not raised with a strong architecture of belief. And while I enormously respect Emerson's work now, it did not provide much in the way of heaven or where is my child right after she died. And so that and the inability to feel, those two tensions were something I struggled with throughout the entire process.
You talk about that a lot in your book, both criticizing yourself or feeling at the time you felt very critical of yourself, and I think you also imagined that other people were criticizing you. Did you ever go back and talk to anyone and ask?
I did. I've asked others, and one thing about losing a child is people are so very careful of you, and so I'm still not sure if people were fully truthful. I will say that the people that I've asked, almost without exception, they've said, we just were so worried about you, and we could see that you were struggling to get a sense of your feelings, and you seemed very stuck. Nobody in my family ever expected me to stiff upper lip and soldier on through. I never got that message from anyone. But
you were raised with that.
I was raised with that as
you.
Such a through line that nobody ever said, well, you have to hold yourself entirely together and never lose control, except these following 3 situations. I never had that. So that was really, really hard to come to terms with. But everyone has really circled around and been very supportive. There were a few people who I definitely felt that they thought I was in denial and not properly processing, or perhaps had an inability to properly attach to my child for the first time. But a lot of times those are woven through their own issues, and so I can't give a lot of time to that.
No. Well, it was very clear to me from reading your book that you were overwhelmed and you were in terrible grief about your daughter, but that you were aware that people didn't know that. That maybe you were in some denial as well, but it's clear that there's a certain amount that you were accepting, but just not able to show other people, at least not when anyone was around, only when you were alone.
Well, and I think we all have our different ways of showing emotion. And for me, the best place that I have found to emote has been walking or running, but out alone. That felt very safe. And so I would take off to the woods to do a lot of my processing. And it was in the woods that it actually became very clear to me what my path forward was going to be in terms of, and this is not just applicable to grief, but I think to any struggle, is I realized I had only 3 choices. They were dying, existing, and living. And I wanted to die, and I think that's most people's first reaction when they hear about the loss of a child. I'd die if that happened to me. I wanted to die too, but I didn't get to.
Right. Well, you had 2 other children.
I had 2 other children and a husband and responsibilities. And existing also seemed, in and of itself, to be not a great option. That even though many of us do that in and out of our days, that seemed rather dreary, and the only option that resonated was living. And that was, again, that came through on a walk, and I had no idea how to get to that place, but it was something that I embraced and became determined to do. And when I ultimately got there, that's when I knew I had to write about the book, because it was such a struggle to get to that place. And I did struggle with the perceptions that I thought people had of me for deciding to live and for moving through the process. And I wanted to share the process with somebody.
Well, had you followed the path of existing as opposed to living, your other children would have lost a sister and a mother.
Exactly. And that's what kept me going initially. That's what got me out of bed. Is the only tragedy that would have been worse than losing one child would have been for the other children to lose their childhood.
Yes.
And so that kept both my husband and me moving forward. And I am most proud of how we parented them in those dark first years. And it wasn't perfect by any measure. There was lots of pizza, there was lots of faking it, there was lots of sort of showing up an empty shell, but we were there. And young children look to their parents, and they want to have things like birthday parties and play dates. And if you're just standing there on the sidelines, sometimes that's all they need. And I think as a result, 10 years out, both of my surviving children are doing very, very well.
The angel in my pocket comes from an actual angel figurine. Can you tell us about your title and how that came about?
Okay, well, in order to get to the title, I have to tell you that what I learned along the way was that you need to do 2 things, and this applies across the board to struggle. You need to look inside of yourself and listen to the wise silence, what Emerson refers to, and really pay attention. And that wise silence is not that nagging voice that's, the shoulda, coulda, woulda. That is definitely not the wise silence. But in equal parts also looking out and being open-minded to other ways of thinking and finding comfort. And that's different for everybody. But there is nothing like a crisis to blow your mind wide open. And so I was really willing to investigate anything, different religions, different ways of thinking, and somebody suggested to me I might want to consider talking to a medium, a psychic medium, who was able to talk to people on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, and I was pulled out of an audience of about 500 people, and this medium came over and started to tell me that Charlotte was there and that she was talking to her, and recounted all sorts of details about Charlotte that nobody would have known.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I'd walked into an auditorium and paid cash for a ticket, but she went on and on and on, drilling down, and finally said something along the lines of she wants to acknowledge a white sparkly thing that you carry in your pocket. And I reached into my pocket and pulled out an angel. And I had found this angel shortly after Charlotte had died, mm-hmm. in her bathroom. We'd just moved into the house. The house had been completely empty of every little thing. Mm-hmm. And yet, far in the back of a shelf was an angel. And when I found it at the time, I thought this was a little message from her. Mm-hmm. And I plopped it in my pocket thinking I would throw it away later or not, but I ended up holding on to it for months, mm-hmm. and had never even told my husband about it, mm-hmm. not a soul. And here was this medium acknowledging that. And so it was very...
And the medium said that Charlotte left it there for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it was very hard to discount that experience. Mm-hmm. And that set the tone for a lot more exploration in terms mm-hmm. of what happens on the other side. When we die, if something of us remains that we're able to communicate with, mm-hmm. that became very compelling to me. And that became a strong sense of faith that I would actually see her again. Mm-hmm. And again, it made it much easier to step back into the flow of life mm-hmm. with that knowledge.
She left it there for you. You carried it around for a long time and then eventually lost it. Mm. Do you think she took it from you because she didn't think you needed it anymore?
Well, that's an interesting spin. I so would love to have it back, mm-hmm. but the way I've been able to find comfort with losing mm-hmm. it, because I was devastated when mm-hmm. I lost it on an airplane. It came out of my pocket. Mm-hmm. And I think I probably didn't need it anymore. And I think that was mm-hmm. God or Charlotte or somebody giving me that message. Mm-hmm. I do feel that.
Yeah.
But I want it back.
Right. Of course, I know. It's hard. But I sort of got that take from that, you know, just thought, I think she took it back. I think she said
it was a strong...
It's time to move on, you know.
Yeah. It was a strong attachment to something that was a representation of her, and mm-hmm. I did get what I needed from it.
Mm-hmm. And we have just a few minutes left, but can you just tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book, what you felt you had to tell other people, what you can offer other parents who might be struggling too?
Well, I think that in many cases in memoir, people write them for different reasons. I wrote this book, The Angel in My Pocket, because I needed it on my nightstand. Mm-hmm. And I was struggling, and when I went to the library and when I went to the bookstores for guidance and roadmaps and a hand and an idea of how other bereaved parents had made it through, and not only through, but to the far side, mm-hmm. I found almost nothing. And there are books out there that describe grief beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there were very few, if any, that described moving through and choosing to embrace life and then looking back mm-hmm. on how they made it to that place. And mm-hmm. because of that, I found it very discouraging when I had decided I'm going to try to make it to that place. Mm-hmm. And along the way, I wrote about how alien that felt mm-hmm. to decide that I was going to live, and mm-hmm. how that seemed in some ways disloyal to her memory, because holding on to the grief is also a way of holding on to our loved ones. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know I had a book to share mm-hmm. until I got to the end point. And again, some say that the best memoir involves transformation, mm-hmm. and while I don't always agree with that, mm-hmm. I do think that in terms of The Angel in My Pocket, that what sets it apart is it starts from learning to descend into the grief mm-hmm. and then taking the reader along the bottom, mm-hmm. but then back out. So what I have heard and what my hope was all along is that it's ultimately an inspiring story of mm-hmm. embracing life and thriving.
It is. It is. Well, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
To our viewers, you've been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. And yes, thank you for being here too.
Well, it was wonderful to be here.
It was, I mean, the book was, I did feel that, you know, when I first saw the title, I thought, oh, you know, as a